Hello, space friends. Captain Snuggles here, bringing you a full exploration of the lore behind one of the most important and divisive events in the X universe. That event is the Second Terraformer War, and by extension, the First Terraformer War and the Terran Conflict. Considering how much grief I've given the Terrans in the past, it's not surprising that this topic has come up a lot in my comments, and now I'm going to give it the attention it deserves. People love to talk about the Second Terraformer War, and I've known for a while that no one can agree on the details. In YouTube comments, Reddit, EgoSoft forums, even the wikis, it's very rare for two posts to have the same version of events. I'd always chalked it up to internet people being selective with their facts, but as I was brushing up on X history for my Major Factions guide, I noticed that the official history of the Second Terraformer War didn't match any of the comments I'd been seeing, and it also didn't match my own recollection of X3 Albion Prelude. I got curious, so I started digging. And digging. And digging. Curiosity became research, research became obsession, and obsession became this video. After hours and hours and hours poring over every source I could possibly find, I finally assembled a full accounting of the facts and figured out why there's no consensus on the events of the Second Terraformer War. To understand that lack of consensus, we need to know 6 things. Number 1, X3 Albion Prelude is our only in-game depiction of the Second Terraformer War. Number 2, the X universe has a main timeline that connects X Beyond the Frontier, X2, X3, X Rebirth, and X4. Number 3, there are branches off of that main timeline, official EgoSoft media that are not part of the canonical sequence of events, almost like a very haphazard multiverse. Number 4, Albion Prelude is not on the main timeline. It's on a branch. It is not part of the canonical sequence of events. Number 5. On the main timeline, the Second Terraformer War is instead covered by a novel and the X Encyclopedia, which are separate paid products, and the novel is only in German. And number 6, EgoSoft did not widely publicize any of that, because at the time they had a don't ask, don't tell approach to timeline discontinuities. Alright, so here's what happened. There was not supposed to be a game in between Terran Conflict and Rebirth. To fill that gap in the canonical timeline, EgoSoft commissioned a novel and some X Encyclopedia entries, both of which were already published when EgoSoft suddenly decided that they wanted a game after all. They tried to quickly adapt the novel into a game, but the novel was not written for game adaptation, and EgoSoft was not able to correctly implement the novel's plot within their time and budget constraints. So, they slapped together a completely different story that borrowed just enough from the novel to create the illusion of plot continuity with X Rebirth. As an example of just how massive the changes are, think back to the big event in the intro cinematic of Albion Prelude. The only thing canon about that depiction of the event is that it does correctly identify one of the people involved. That's it. Everything else is non-canon. The timing, the nature of the event, and the aftermath were all changed dramatically, and obviously that changes the entire story. To learn the details, I guess you'll just have to keep watching. You could find that crazy info on the official EgoSoft forums around the time Albion Prelude released, and you could also figure it out on your own by reading the X Encyclopedia or the novel. These days, you can also find a very abridged version in the X4 in-game encyclopedia timeline, if you found the right data vaults. Back in the day, if you didn't explicitly ask on the forums or pay real money for a book, you played through Albion Prelude believing you were experiencing the canonical storyline of the Second Terraformer War. But you weren't. The real story is hidden behind a paywall, a language barrier, and a lot of very misleading in-game content. I'm going to peel back those layers to give you the true canonical story of the Second Terraformer War. I will be using primary sources, mainly the X Encyclopedia. I will provide page numbers and direct quotes. I will sometimes need to paraphrase, and I'll be explicit when that happens. If the encyclopedia is ever missing content or context, I will draw on other sources, and I'll be explicit about that too. Please understand, this will be vastly different from your recollection of X3 Albion Prelude, but this is the official timeline that all other X games are based on. Buckle up, because this story is neither fun nor straightforward. This is a frustrating, morally gray tale about the collision of arrogance and recklessness. There are a lot of villains, very few heroes, and no happy endings. Now with that in mind, let's learn some lore. To learn about the Second Terraformer War, we first need to learn about the First Terraformer War. It won't take long because it wasn't much of a war. In the late 21st century, the humans of Earth developed jump gate technology. Upon traveling through the gate, they discovered that space is a harsh environment, and terraforming planets for colonization would be a monumental task for fragile humans. So, they ignored 100 years of sci-fi tropes and developed Artificial General Intelligence, AGI, which is a self-evolving AI that they loaded onto self-replicating spaceships equipped with tools powerful enough to reshape entire planets. Because what could possibly go wrong? They were so eager to get started that they did not include any failsafe hardware to prevent what's called goal drift, or in layman's terms, going rogue. On the 26th of May 2066, the first terraformer fleet launched, followed by a second. A third fleet was constructed, but only partially launched. After the second fleet, Earth finally realized that maybe it should patch in some safeguards, and after the third fleet, the terraformer program was cancelled entirely, but it was too late. In 2115, the first CPU ship gained self-awareness. In 2145, a terraformer fleet arrived in Earth orbit. It took them less than a year to crush the woefully underprepared Earth Navy and lay waste to the Blue Planet, along with all her colonies. The war would ultimately claim over 5 billion lives. The remnants of humanity were saved by former search and rescue pilot Nathan Ridley Gunn and a handful of heroes. Gunn rallied the ragtag survivors of Earth's Navy, lured the terraformers through the jump gate, and blew up the gate behind them, separating themselves and the machines from Earth for good. This is the point at which humanity diverged into Argon and Terrans. Gunn waged a long guerrilla campaign against his terraformer pursuers, rescued survivors from Earth's outlying colonies, and began building a new society from scratch. Their society would become the Argon Federation. Meanwhile, those who stayed behind began to rebuild, and eventually they reorganized into the Government of Earth and the Outer Solar System, GEOS, colloquially known as the Terrans. During the coming 8 centuries, the Argon and Terrans had a lot of rebuilding to do. The Argon were starting almost from scratch, with a tiny number of people, limited expertise, and very little infrastructure. Given their origins as a ragtag band of survivors, it's not surprising that they developed into an egalitarian democracy. They discovered the other races of the X universe, formed some alliances, and made some enemies. Then, in 2330, the Xenon appeared, having evolved from the second terraformer fleet in deep space. From then on, the Argon faced frequent conflict, and their growth slowed dramatically as a result. The Argon military were always the underdogs. Like Nathan Gunn before them, they relied on clever tactics, individual heroism, and sheer tenacity to win against impossible odds. With those methods, they saved the human race once, the galaxy twice, and themselves countless times. Does that sound too good to be true? Well, it is. The Argon genuinely won a lot of victories and did a lot of good through skill and heroism, but not every commander is Nathan Gunn, and not every pilot is an ace. The heroes needed a safety net, even if they didn't know it, and so the Argon Secret Service came into being. This network of spooks watched from the sidelines, manipulating the circumstances behind the scenes, quietly doing whatever was necessary to make sure the heroes came home victorious. They seem to have operated semi-autonomously, and most service members and policymakers probably had no idea they ever got involved. But they were there, they were official, and they were a dark shadow looming behind the naive heroism of the Argonne. Meanwhile, the Terrans also had a very rough first few hundred years. Earth was ecologically devastated by the war. Famine and disease laid waste to the survivors. Finally, though, they patched up their broken world, reorganized their society, and then focused all their energies on weapons development. Quote, in anticipation of a possible renewed attack from the terraformers, the government had forced through a series of major improvements. A vast naval fleet had been built, and the Earth was now encircled by a giant defensive ring, the Taurus Eternal, which resided in permanent orbit 500 kilometers above the surface of the planet. End quote. Looking at that passage, and thinking back to the first Terraformer War, it isn't hard to read between the lines. The people of Earth were nearly wiped out due to their own carelessness and their military unpreparedness. The survivors became absolutely fixated on correcting those mistakes through hypervigilance, extreme militarization, and heavy-handed government. As for that government itself, Geos, we do not have that much direct information. But we can make some educated guesses based on the information we do have. It mobilized enough resources to encase the Earth in a comically large fortress, so it must wield enormous power over the economy, and it's clearly fanatical about security. Based on X3 Terran Conflict and X4, we know it used some form of social credit system, where your rights depended on A, your place of birth, and B, your service to the state. From the official description of the Sagaris pioneers, we know that people with a low social credit score had almost zero rights, although not exactly zero rights. The Pioneer Roundup took place after the Second Terraformer War, but it was soon enough afterwards that it almost certainly used the same legal framework that Geos used before the war. So put that all together and you get a clear picture of a heavy-handed authoritarian government with a very high emphasis on national security and a very low emphasis on individual rights. Boy, oh boy, I wonder what'll happen if those guys meet a freedom-loving democracy. If only we had some sort of historical precedent. Oh well, I guess we'll just have to wait and see. Specifically, we have to wait until the year 2932, when Argonne and Terran were reunited by the reactivation of the Sol Jumpgate. After 8 long centuries of separation, they actually got off to a surprisingly great start by joining forces against the Ka'ak. Then, in 2935, quote, taken by surprise and swept up by enthusiasm for their new allies, the Argonne offered Earth membership in the Argonne Federation. End quote. That would have granted Earth membership in the community of planets and made her Argonne Prime's equal. However, the Terrans, quote, firmly declined the offer of membership in the community of planets. Earth saw herself as superior. End quote. So, after a strong start, the downward spiral begins. Because what do Earth superpowers do to nations they see as inferior? They give them the CIA treatment. Quote, despite her refusal to join the community of planets, Earth was nonetheless attempting to exert influence over the Argonne Federation. In 2942, a secret service network was covertly introduced. When this eventually came to light several years later, the relationship between the Federation and Earth noticeably cooled. And what do Earth superpowers do when the CIA treatment fails? They send in the troops. In 2944, quote, matters took an even greater step for the worse when, under the auspices of its AGI control legislation, Geos ordered a USC fleet to the edge of Argonne Federation territory. Conflict was inevitable. End quote. That conflict would be aptly named the Terran Conflict. But why did it begin? The phrase under the auspices of its AGI control legislation, is pretty vague, but we'll try to piece together what happened. As a pretext for invasion, the Terrans accused the Argonne of some sort of AGI-related crime that was serious enough to violate their national sovereignty. The exact crime is left unsaid, so let's look into everything the Argonne were doing with AGI at the time. To do that, we need to flip forward a few sections in the encyclopedia and back a few years in the timeline. Quote, in 2932, the Jefferson-Nela expedition discovered a hibernation chamber built several centuries earlier by Dr. Martine Winters, the renegade terraformer expert from Old Earth. Winters was successfully revived and would eventually return to the Community of Planets with the expedition. The Community of Planets was beginning to suffer from increasing internal political and economical turmoil. It was in this context that Winters campaigned for the revival of the Terraformer project, albeit without success. Neither the Argonne Federation nor any other government of the community was willing to lend their support to his case. Eventually, Winters offered his services to the Beryl, an organization specializing in the theft and trade of advanced technology. The Beryl, in fact a part of the Yaqui Syndicate, agreed to provide Winters with unlimited resources in return for knowledge of and access to Terraformer/Xenon technology. This mutual agreement, while highly successful, was also almost universally illegal. In order to achieve his dreams, Winters became a criminal. End quote. Remember, the Terrans had spies in the Argonne Federation government shortly after this. They knew that the Argonne refused to develop AGI even at a time when they sorely needed it. They also knew that all nations of the Commonwealth had very strict laws against AGI. So then, why were they invading? The X Encyclopedia doesn't say, but the X4 in-game encyclopedia timeline does. Quote, Terrans had fostered a deep distrust of any and all artificial intelligence. They bid the Community of Planets to allow computer-controlled ships to be inspected by the AGI Task Force for any potentially dangerous systems. The Community of Planets refused. Strictly determined that AGI never again become a threat to Sol, the Terran government ordered the USC and ATF to fly into Argonne space. End quote. So the Terrans tried to infiltrate and manipulate the Argonne government. They got caught, and then they immediately demanded access to all computer-controlled ships in the entire Community of Planets. Not AGI-controlled ships, not AI-controlled ships, computer-controlled ships. This entry makes clear distinctions between the three, and we are talking about the latter. The Terrans demanded the right to search and seize anything with an autopilot anywhere in the universe. Obviously, no sane government would ever agree to that, even if the Terrans hadn't just gotten caught giving the Argonne the CIA treatment. Comparing that passage on the X4 timeline with the info from the encyclopedia, there's one really important distinction. The encyclopedia says the Terrans sent their fleet to the Argonne border, but they don't specify which side. The X4 timeline says they sent the fleet into Argonne space. So, that means the Terran military violated Argonne sovereignty by moving into the border system circle of labor, and possibly beyond into the core system Omicron Lyri. Here, the encyclopedia changes topics and doesn't say what happens next in the military campaign, so we are continuing on the X4 timeline. Quote, the Community of Planets was quick to see the Terran fleet moving through Argonne space as an act of aggression and reacted accordingly. War fell onto the Jumpgate network once again, and thousands more were killed as the community came to realize just how advanced Terran technology was in comparison to their own. So, the Terrans invaded, the Argonne and their allies fought back, and they got absolutely massacred. Centuries of constant conflict had stunted their technological growth and depleted their armed forces. They were absolutely no match for the massive, pristine armadas of the Terran Navy. The Argonne were never going to surrender their sovereignty, They were always going to fight to the bitter end, but no amount of skill or heroism would save them this time. Which means it's time for the safety net. Quote, as the diplomatic relations between the Argon Federation and Earth became ever more strained, despite its profound reservations, the Argon government saw no other way forward than to contact Martine Winters for technological assistance. Earth technology was far in advance of that of the community. Only terraformer advances might enable the community to achieve some form of parity. Unfortunately, involving Winters inevitably involved the Beryl as well. Reluctantly, the Argon Federation Secret Service was forced to hand over parts of the covert operations inside the Sol system to the Beryl. End quote. Up until now, the conflict has been entirely a story of Terran paranoia and aggression. But now the Argon Secret Service has entered the scene, and the downward spiral accelerates rapidly. The rogue scientist the Argon cast out years ago is now their only hope, but now he's a package deal. To get his product, they have to give partial operational control to pirates. That's a hell of a concession, so the product better be worth it. Here's Winters' sales pitch. Quote, modern AGI systems are equipped with the hardwired mission goal circuit not accessible to internal revisions. End quote. He offers the Argon Secret Service extremely powerful, non-sentient drones that use terraformer hulls and weapons, but can never go rogue, on the condition that Beryl gets to control them. They accept his offer. What they don't know is that, quote, even such systems as these cannot prevent goal drift completely. Depending on the design, VN machines capable of self-modification usually begin to develop incremental goal drift after the 96th generation, or thereabouts. If we extrapolate the length of a generation from the records of the first Terraformer War, it comes out to about 6.7 years, which means goal drift begins in about 640 years. So, although this design is vastly improved over the original, it is still flawed. It isn't clear whether Winters himself is aware of this, and it also isn't clear whether he would care. When talking about the deal between Argon, Beryl, and Winters, the encyclopedia hammers us with phrases like profound reservations, no other way forward, reluctantly, and forced to hand over. The author is really trying to drive home that the Argon are choosing this path only under great duress. It also isn't clear whether the government or the Navy are fully aware of the deal the Secret Service is making, or if they're just blindly charging forth with their usual naive heroism. But, in the end, the Secret Service is an official Argon agency, and it chooses to violate Commonwealth law and deploy AGI drones against the Terrans. So, everyone has their hands dirty now. What happens next? Well, we've finally arrived at the Second Terraformer War. Quote, the Second Terraformer War began in spring of Earth year 2946. A fleet of terraformer ships and drones arrived in the Sol system under Beryl control and began a systematic attack on the inner planets, Venus, Mars, and Earth. Earth's entire fleet was in other systems and could not be recalled quickly enough. Earth was defenseless. The Taurus Eternal, Earth's last line of defense, was destroyed on 5th February 2948, leaving the blue planet utterly without hope and at the mercy of a rampaging swarm of terraformer assembler drones. End quote. Two things to clarify here. First, the timeline. Remember, the Terran invasion of Argon space began in 2944. Then, as part of that conflict, the Second Terraformer War began with the Beryl counterattack 2 years later, in 2946. Then, the Taurus was destroyed 2 years after that, in 2948. Second bit of clarification, we learn in X3 Terran conflict that the Taurus is not just a massive fortress. It also contains shipyards, huge fighter hangars, and command and control centers for the Terran navies. It is the single most valuable military installation in the X universe and the backbone of the Terran war machine. Now, let's get into that text. There are some discrepancies here. The first paragraph says Earth was defenseless, but the second says the Taurus Eternal held off the attackers for almost 2 years. It also doesn't explain why none of Earth's fleets could be called back within those 2 years, or where they were. But we can make an educated guess. After 2 years of fighting a hopeless war, the Argon and their allies have probably been pushed very far from the Terran border, and the Terrans have apparently pursued them with their entire navy. The Argon are scrappy, and they have a history of guerrilla tactics, so the Terrans probably can't move freely back through the space they've conquered. Obviously, sending your entire navy that deep into enemy territory with no clear line of withdrawal is an abysmal tactical move. But the Terrans haven't fought a real war in 800 years, so their tactics are a little rusty. One crucial thing we don't learn from that passage is exactly what happened to the Taurus. So, let's find out. After some more digging, we find ourselves in the biography section of Saya Ko. Saya is a well-known good guy, one of the 3 heroes who defeated the Ka'ak in X2, holder of the official title Hero of the Community of Planets, and a former captain in the Argon Navy. She's half Terran, half Argon, but she has an overwhelming preference for the Argon side. As the Terran conflict escalates, she eagerly takes on a role as an Argon Secret Service double agent, and travels to Earth, using her Terran heritage to gain entry. Then she comes up with an insane plan. Quote, "Around this time, Saya, who had begun to fear that the long smoldering Terran conflict would lead to defeat for her beloved Argon Prime, was forced, in the absence of alternatives, to take extreme measures. After killing the Terran agent Leah Singer to protect her cover, she and her husband Sherman Hiatu fled to Earth, where they devised the plan to destroy Earth's last line of defense, the Taurus Eternal. On 5th February 2948, Saya Ko and her husband put their plan into action. In the full knowledge that they would both be killed, they initiated the total destruction of the Taurus Eternal. At the last moment, however, Saya, bitterly reproaching herself for what she had done, refused to put on a spacesuit, and during the final collapse of the structure was blown out into space." End quote. There's another really odd discrepancy here. The second paragraph says Saya planned this as a suicide attack, and then it immediately turns around and says that she decided to commit suicide at the last moment. There are several other strange things as well. First off, it's made extremely clear that no one ordered Saya to do this. She and her husband came up with this plan on their own. Second, they came up with this plan when the Terran conflict was still smoldering, meaning at least 2 years prior to the destruction of the Taurus, and probably more like 4 years. Third, she felt forced in the absence of alternatives, meaning that at no point in those several years could she come up with any better ideas than a suicide attack. Fourth, this is Saya Ko, a famously heroic named character, not some 2-bit nobody. And, last but not least, there's no mention of how just 2 people managed to destroy the largest military installation in the universe. Put all those things together, you get a hell of a lot of plot holes. Let's see if we can fill any of those plot holes using the novel X3 Watchers of Earth. Again, it's only in German, so I pulled this info from a translated, author-approved synopsis. In the novel, the Terran agent Leah Singer is actually Saya's friend. They discover one another's identities, and a fight breaks out. At some point, a blaster is drawn, and as the 2 of them struggle over the weapon, Saya accidentally shoots Leah in the chest, killing her. She proceeds with the mission, but she's absolutely stricken with grief and is barely functional. That emotional state explains why she's so committed to a suicide attack. It isn't a convincing explanation given Saya's history, but it is an explanation. We don't know why her husband agreed with the suicide plan, though. It seems like he was just along for the ride. But here's the big reveal. In the novel, they don't actually destroy the Taurus. They disable it with minimal casualties by activating an emergency procedure called segment separation. There is no cataclysmic explosion, there are no mass casualties, and no rain of debris falls to Earth. That is insanely different from what we were shown in the Albion Prelude intro cinematic, but the X4 in-game timeline confirms this version of events and resolves some discrepancies. Quote, "They initiated an emergency procedure known as segment separation. Taurus Eternal would separate into its constituent 420 segments that drifted into a higher orbit, hereby irrevocably destroying the Taurus. Although the number of casualties was low because the segments sealed themselves to act as lifeboats, some individuals in the connecting elements were killed, among them Saya Ko and Sherman Hiatu. Neither body was ever found." End quote. So, this firmly establishes the novel version as canon and the Albion Prelude version as non-canon. But Egosoft is trying to quietly reconcile some of the differences by defining segment separation as irrevocable destruction. They're telling us, yes, the Taurus was destroyed, but when we say destroyed, we mean dismantled with minimal loss of life. Those explosions you saw in the intro cinematic were just controlled separations of the connecting elements. And if you thought you saw pieces raining down on Earth, you were wrong. They were migrating into a higher orbit. Now obviously that is not what the Albion Prelude intro showed, or what the plot of Albion Prelude described, but Egosoft is trying to at least slightly reconcile it with the canonical timeline. So, that resolves the main events at the Taurus. As for Saya's death, the sources disagree. The X4 timeline just says Saya died in the connecting elements and doesn't mention suicide. The novel says she was overcome with grief, gave up on life, and allowed security forces to trap her in a connecting element, basically a spur-of-the-moment assisted suicide. And the X Encyclopedia says she both planned and did not plan to commit suicide. So the details are unclear, but it seems like Saya somehow chose to end her life in a connecting element as the fortress broke apart. One more really important point about the Taurus. Although Saya and her husband concocted the plan on their own, the X4 timeline does state that they coordinated the plan's execution, quote, with the Federal and Beryl fleets to strike the planet as soon as the space station had been removed, end quote. As far as we know, the Federal fleet was nowhere near Earth, so it would have been Beryl doing the striking, but the Argon Navy probably had some role in the operation out on the front lines. What was the goal of that operation? What did everyone want to get out of it? We know the Argon Navy's goal, to end the Terran invasion. It seems likely that they wanted to incorporate Saya's plan into a shock and awe campaign, a massive push on the front line coupled with a devastating blow to the rear to force the Terrans to surrender. And even if the Terrans didn't surrender, they still would have lost their most valuable military asset, so of course the Argon would like the plan. But what did the Beryl get out of this? Their singular goal was always to steal technology, so then the question becomes, were they satisfied with their winnings and ready to force a surrender like the Argon? Or did they want something more, something on Earth itself? Unfortunately, I couldn't find an answer to that question. But we can at least think about what might have happened if Beryl's drones had reached Earth's surface. Earth certainly would have had plenty of valid military targets. For example, with the Taurus dismantled, their last remaining command and control centers are probably on the surface. But of course, there were numerous potential civilian targets as well. So, let's try to think about whether any of those could have been on the target list. We have no way of knowing exactly what the drones were programmed to do. We have no record of their precise behavior during the war. The Albion Prelude intro only shows them attacking military targets, but we know that's a wildly unreliable source. It seems very likely that the X Encyclopedia or the X4 timeline would say if they had attacked civilian targets, but that's speculation. So, instead we have to try to deduce for ourselves the likelihood that the drones would have attacked civilian targets on Earth. For starters, we know they can't go rogue for at least 640 years, so they couldn't order themselves, meaning someone would have had to order them. There's no precedent in Argon history for massive attacks against civilians. That would go against everything the Argon stand for, even the Secret Service. But they weren't controlling the drones. Winters and Beryl were. Winters was originally just a scientist who really loved the terraformers. He quickly showed himself to be neither cautious nor virtuous, and he certainly didn't improve during his long hibernation, but he was still devoted first and foremost to pursuing his dream of spreading terraformers throughout the universe. He would kill people to achieve his goal, but his goal is just more robots, so I don't see how murdering civilians would contribute to that. Meanwhile, the Beryl were pirates whose goal was to steal technology, so although they wouldn't go out of their way to cause civilian casualties, I doubt they would mind piling up a few bodies in the process of snagging some shiny tech. So, out of everyone involved, the Beryl are the only ones with the means and motivation to attack civilian targets on Earth. There's no hard evidence they were actually planning to do that, but there is a non-zero chance. One thing's for certain. Regardless of the actual intentions of the Argon and Beryl and Winters, as the Taurus broke into pieces overhead and the red pinpricks of terraformer engines lit up the sky, the Terrans would have universally believed that they were about to be slaughtered by mechanical monsters once again. With that, we have reached the climax of the story. Let's summarize what we've learned so far. First, the Terrans rejected membership in the Community of Planets and instead launched a campaign of clandestine manipulation against the Argon government. Then, when that failed, the Terrans demanded search and seizure rights for basically all ships of all nations anywhere in the universe. When that failed, the Terrans invaded Argon space and slaughtered the Commonwealth navies that tried to stop them. At this point, the Argon Secret Service felt compelled to even the odds by making a deal with the rogue scientist Winters and his pirate buddies, the Beryl. Simultaneously, the Secret Service dispatched agents to the inner solar system, including the renowned heroine Sayako. During this time, Winters and Beryl concocted a plan to send 10 billion drones swarming through the solar system, which theoretically they could call off at any time. 2 years into the war, they executed their plan. Then over the next 2 years, the Terrans failed to recall any forces to defend the solar system, presumably due to their tactical inexperience. Then, last but not least, Sayako disabled the Taurus, dealing a crippling blow to the Terran military with minimal immediate loss of life, but potentially opening up Earth to pirate raids using AGI drones. Now, at this point, the Taurus is disabled. Earth's fleets have still failed to redeploy. 10 billion drones are swarming down upon the defenseless blue planet, and, surprise surprise, the pirates don't seem keen on calling them off just yet. How will the Terrans survive? Well, they'll do the exact same thing they did the first time. Lure them through a jump gate. Only this time, they've pointed the jump gate at a black hole, which means certain destruction for the drones and certain death for the person who lures them through. That person is Elena Ko, Sayako's mother and another heroine of the X universe. And so, our bitter tale of arrogance and desperation ends with the suicides of mother and daughter, two of the series' most beloved characters. In the aftermath, the ancient overseers of our local supercluster decided enough was enough. Even though the Beryl drones were wiped out and the Xenon population was at an all-time low, they still did not like the sudden appearance of 10 billion self-replicating machines. The Second Terraformer War prompted the Ancients to take the Xenon seriously. Quote, "The terraformers sent out by Earth, particularly the Second Fleet and its descendants, pose a critical threat to the Virgo supercluster, and possibly to the universe entire. In order to slow the spread of the VN terraformers, if nothing else, all transstellar jumpgate networks within the Milky Way have been deactivated. The ancients refer to this strategy as a fire break, in an analogy to a strategy used in an attempt to contain forest fires. When the fire break will end, not even the ancients can say." End quote. The fire break, aka the Jumpgate shutdown, plunged the Commonwealth into turmoil while leaving the Terrans relatively unaffected, and the end of the fire break is the starting point for the plot of X4. So the Second Terraformer War is the most critical event in understanding the universe of X4, and hopefully this video helped shed some light on it. As for the morality of the situation, who the hell knows? Does the unprovoked Terran invasion justify the Argon breaking universal AGI law? Was it acceptable for the Argon to put the people of Earth at the mercy of pirates to preserve the sovereignty of every other nation in the galaxy? Could Saya Ko have made a better choice? Did Elena Ko have to die? Was any of it worth it for anyone? Good luck pondering on all that. I'm done. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you'll tune in next time. And until then, this is Captain Snuggles, signing off.